Pine Railroad, my new O-scale layout. Now, I've been playing with HO-scale trains for pretty much my whole life, and I always thought O-scale was cool, but until we moved into this house, I didn't really have room for it. Now I do, so since my HO layout's pretty much complete, I decided to forego the usual small starter layout and jump into the O-scale world with both feet. This layout is about 7 by 16 feet, twice the size of my HO layout. Rather than using the super tight curves that many O-gauge layouts have, I wanted to keep the curve radius as large as possible for a more scale appearance and so I could run longer equipment, so I took the basic double-track loop configuration of my previous HO layout, the Red Oak Railway, and simply scaled it up. Like the Red Oak Railway, this layout, being a continuous loop around the walls, has to have a swinging gate so that I can get in and out of the room. Now, unlike the Red Oak Railway, this one goes up instead of down so that gravity can hold it in place. When it's up, eventually I'll have a proper latch system, but for now I just have a little piece of chain I can hook on there, and it stays up. I do need to add an electrical interlock so that trains won't Back to the Future 3 themselves off of here and fall onto the floor. However, that is one of many things that I still need to get to on this layout. For now, I'm just gonna have to be careful. The two parallel tracks allow me to run two trains in opposite directions continuously all the way around, and the inside loop has a passing siding and several industrial spurs. The plan for operation is to run a passenger train continuously on the outside loop, possibly having a station over there that it can stop at periodically, while at the same time I'm doing freight and switching operations on the inside loop. O-gauge track is measured by diameter instead of radius, so the O72 curves on the outside loop are actually 36-inch radius, roughly the equivalent of a 20-inch radius in HO. The inner loop is O63, and the curved siding, the sharpest curve on the layout, is O54. I decided not to film the entire construction process this time because most of it was very similar to how I built the HO layout, which I documented very thoroughly. The benchwork is made up of hollow core doors on basic wooden legs. I'm a big fan of using doors for layout benchwork. They're relatively lightweight, very structurally strong, and can often be found very cheap or even free. This is the second layout I've built on doors after the Red Oak, and I love how much time and effort they save in the benchwork phase of construction. Unlike my current HO layout, since this one doesn't have any scenic features above track level, I didn't bother putting down a layer of foam and just laid the roadbed directly on top of the doors. I used cork roadbed from Midwest Products, but I had a hard time finding enough of the O-scale stuff. However, I discovered that the HO stuff is exactly the same thickness and 2/3 of the width, so if I lay down 3 half strips of HO cork instead of 2 strips of O-scale cork, it equals the same width and height. About half the layout was done this way, and with the track in place, the difference is pretty much invisible. As you saw in the intro, I used hot glue to hold the track to the roadbed, and Elmer's glue to hold the roadbed to the doors. If you do this on your layout, be sure to use the regular Elmer's Glue-All, not the school glue stuff. The regular stuff is stronger and more water resistant after it dries. The layout is built with Gargraves track, which can be ordered with either wood or plastic ties. I went with plastic because it was cheaper, and once I paint and weather the track, the difference shouldn't be too noticeable. One of the biggest mistakes I made on my HO layout was not soldering all the rail joints before I painted the track, and that has resulted in some minor electrical issues over the years. To avoid that on this layout, I soldered all the joints and added feeder wires every 6 feet or so. I used 16 gauge wire, which should be enough to handle the amperage to run several trains at once. Hollow rail track like Gargraves has somewhat looser dimensional standards than the solid rail track used in other scales, so there's a few spots where the joints don't fit together perfectly. This presented a problem when soldering the joints, so in these cases I cut a small piece of wire and soldered it into the web of the rail as an electrical bridge. One thing that required a bit of tinkering was the Gargraves switches. These are significantly less expensive than most other brands of O-scale switches, and that's reflected in the quality. Rather than individual ties, the entire base of the switch is molded as one piece of plastic, and the rails are attached with staples. The frogs and guardrails required some adjustment to fit properly and operate smoothly, and I had to glue down some that were loose. These switches also require feeder wires on both diverging routes, since there's no internal jumpers to allow power to pass through the switch. However, with some work, I've managed to make them work pretty well, and for the price I paid, I can't complain. I've also started collecting a modest fleet of O-scale rolling stock. My nicest locomotive at the moment is this MTH Rail King steam switcher, which is based on a Pennsylvania B6, but lettered Chicago and Northwestern for some reason. I eventually plan to custom letter it for my fictional Lone Pine Railroad. You probably noticed in the intro that this locomotive has a very effective smoke unit. MTH locomotives have a reputation for smoking up a storm, and this one is no different. For smoke fluid, I'm using food-grade propylene glycol, which is about as safe and non-toxic as smoke fluid gets. But smoke units are still messy and finicky contraptions, so I usually leave the smoke turned off and only turn it on for special occasions. Speaking of which, yes, I am still working on the water-based smoke unit that you've all been asking about in the comments. It's been pretty far down the priority list until recently, but I do want to start working on it again. My eventual plan is to create a 3D printable file that you can download and easily build your own to fit various common G-scale locomotives, probably a Bachmann Big Hauler, and then once I've done that, work on a puffing mechanism and a way to miniaturize it for O-scale. I don't think HO is going to happen. My other working locomotive right now is this old Lion Chief RS3, but it's pretty cheap and flimsy and it doesn't pull very much, so I'll probably sell it soon and get a nicer diesel to replace it. I also have a couple more steam engines that are currently taken apart for major repairs, including the Williams 460 that I showed in a previous video, and another MTH engine that blew up its soundboard. Both will be getting custom detailing, paint jobs, and all new electronics. The freight cars are from a couple different manufacturers, including MTH, Lionel, and Weaver. I've been careful to only buy scale-sized equipment rather than semi-scale and O27 stuff, which runs on the same track but is noticeably smaller. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference just looking at pictures, so I did end up with a few semi-scale items which are going up for sale on my eBay store. In case you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. These Williams passenger cars are also scale-sized and can be found surprisingly cheap. I do wish they had interiors and the light bulbs draw a lot of power, but that's nothing a 3D printer and some LEDs can't fix. They're also quite heavy, and the RS3 has trouble pulling them, but the heavy die-cast MTH steam engine handles them just fine. Anyway, folks, that's where things are at on the O-scale layout. Obviously, there's a lot left to do. I need to finish the wiring, add command control, put in scenery and a backdrop, things like that. But in due time, as it happens, it'll all be documented on the channel. I'm probably not going to post videos on this layout quite as often as I did on the HO layout because I just have more stuff going on nowadays, but I'll try and keep the updates fairly regular. For now, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.